Well, good evening, everyone, and hello. My name is Alan Berger. This is the Thursday night Southern California meeting for a fellowship of men and women interested in emotional sobriety. I am the host of this group. We are a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other so that we may discover how to live a better life. The only requirement for membership is your desire to be here. If you have a desire to be here, you're welcome. There are no dues or fees for membership. We are not allied with any sect, denomination, organization, institution, or other 12-step group, and we do not wish to engage in any controversy. We neither endorse nor oppose any causes. Our primary purpose is to help ourselves and help others understand and achieve emotional sobriety. We share a common problem, which is what brings us together. Bill Wilson identified emotional dependence as an impediment to his emotional maturity. He realized that his dependence on people and circumstances for his emotional security and self-esteem was a basic flaw that eventually led him to become an alcoholic in the first place. We recognize that emotional dependency is toxic and harmful to our emotional maturity. It is based on the erroneous belief that we need things to be a particular way for us to be okay. This turns us into control freaks, mistakenly believing we need life to conform to our expectations if we're going to be happy or satisfied. Well, we have found this to be utter nonsense. In fact, the real truth is that no real happiness can be attained until we surrender our crippling expectations about how life is supposed to be and learn to cope with life as it is. This meeting focuses on issues related to our emotional sobriety. We come together to explore and discover new possibilities in our lives. We believe that it is possible to overcome our emotional dependency and the unreasonable expectations and unenforceable rules that arise from our unhealthy dependence. I've now asked Brian, my co-host, to read an excerpt from Bill Wilson's article that was called The Next Frontier Emotional Sobriety. Actually, it was a letter that was published in the Grapevine 2 years later under the title The Next Frontier Emotional Sobriety. Brian?
All right. I think that many oldsters who have put our booze gear to severe but successful tests still find that they often lack emotional sobriety. Perhaps they will be the spearhead for the next major development in AA, the development of much more real maturity and balance, which is to say humility in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God. Those adolescent urges that so many of us have for top approval, perfect security, and perfect romance, urges quite appropriate to age 17, proved to be an impossible way of life when we are at age 47 or 57. Here's the aha moment that Bill experienced. Suddenly, I realized what the matter was. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these things according to my perfectionist dreams and specifications, I had fought for them. And when defeat came, so did my depression. The solution Bill discovered was that if we examine every disturbance we have, great or small, we will find at the root of it some unhealthy dependency and its consequent unhealthy demand. Let us, with God's help, continually surrender these hobbling demands. Then we can be set free to live and love. We may then be able to 12-step ourselves and others into emotional sobriety.
Well, that's what this group is all about, is 12-stepping ourselves and others into emotional sobriety. We're going to be changing the format of this meeting. And for the next several months, we're going to take a deep dive into how the 12 steps operate to facilitate the achievement of emotional sobriety. Tonight, we're going to be starting with step 1. Now, here's how the evening is going to be organized. First, I'm going to discuss the psychological and spiritual forces operating in this step for approximately 30 minutes. During that time, Mary Gordon is going to be joining me as a discussant. And if there's something that she thinks can sweeten the pot, she'll jump in and share it with us as well. After I've shared for those 30 minutes and discussed some of the ideas I have that I want to share with you tonight, then we're going to open it up for a half an hour discussion. Now, that will be for the remaining 30 minutes. To participate, you're going to raise your hand just like you did before. Brian, will you tell everybody how to do that now?
Yes, sir. So at the bottom of the screen, there are a bunch of buttons. One is labeled participants. And if you go ahead and click that, a menu will pop up. And at the bottom right of that menu, there is a button labeled raise hand. And if you click that, a little blue hand will pop up to the right of your name.
So we encourage you to do that. And I'm going to ask to stay tightly focused on the topic tonight. So when you discuss this, I want you to discuss what your thoughts are about how this step is related to the achievement of emotional sobriety. Each person that raises their hand is going to have 2 minutes to share their thoughts. At 1.5 minutes, Brian will announce that you have 30 minutes or 30 seconds remaining, not 30 minutes, 30 seconds remaining. So please begin to wrap up your discussion at this time. At 2 minutes, he will announce that your time is up. So let me jump right into this. You know, I think it was a surprise to me, which I was surprised that I was surprised about it, but that I found in the 12 and 12, in the second paragraph where Bill is discussing step 12, that he explicitly states that if we practice these principles in our daily affairs, and he was talking about the 12 steps, he goes that we and those about us will begin to achieve emotional sobriety. So the explicit purpose of working the steps is for the achievement of emotional sobriety. And I think it's going to be clear as I talk about Bill's concept of emotional sobriety before we dig into step one, what makes emotional sobriety so important in our recovery. But that's something that I had never seen. And I've read that 12 and 12 so many times. And it's funny how you can go back and read something and something jumps out at you that you hadn't seen before. So let me throw out some ideas about this concept of emotional sobriety, because we need to understand what it is if we're going to understand how the steps help us achieve it. Well, here's what I call Bill's explicit definitions of emotional sobriety. Explicit means these are things that he said that you can go back and find specific quotes for. So one of the ways he's referred to emotional sobriety is as true independence of spirit. Now, what this means is that when we achieve emotional sobriety, we achieve emotional autonomy, that our behavior is not overly influenced by what other people are doing or not doing, by what's happening in situations or in our environment, that we become the determining force in our own lives. He also described emotional sobriety as real maturity and balance in our lives. So that begs the question, well, what is maturity? Well, maturity can be defined as the transcendence of environmental support, where I'm looking for my environment to make me okay, to self-support, where I'm able to stand on my own 2 feet. Now, that is not a defiant independence. That doesn't mean I don't need anyone. What it means is that I take responsibility for what I need. I don't depend on Mary if Mary and I are in a relationship to take care of me. If I need something from Mary, it's my job to go to her and say, God, I miss you. I'd like to spend time with you, instead of saying, God, if you were a good girlfriend, you'd want to spend time with me. See, that's how I would now project the responsibility onto her, because I don't want to be vulnerable and say I need to be with her. So real maturity is when I am supporting myself rather than trying to manipulate my environment to provide for me the things that I need. Now, the balance is this thing about being able to stay balanced over my own 2 feet. So we're going to be talking about this concept of an emotional center of gravity. So when my emotional center of gravity is over my 2 feet, and it's well balanced over both feet, then I'm in a real strong position, right? That's our physical center of gravity, if it were our weight is equally distributed. And when I took Taekwondo, they called it the horse stance. You bend your knees a little bit and you drop down. They called it the immovable stance. Well, that's what happens when we have emotional sobriety. that we're able to be grounded in our lives. We're unshakable. That doesn't mean we don't get knocked off balance. That would be ridiculous, expectation to say that if we achieve emotional sobriety, nothing's ever going to knock us off balance or disrupt our equilibrium. That's going to happen in life. That's just what it is. But when we have emotional sobriety, we recover that balance quickly. We don't stay out of balance. And the only way I used to recover my balance was to get drunk or to get high. I mean, that was, and talk about disrupting another equilibrium, but that's another story for another day. The other thing he talks about is that this emotional sobriety is based on humility in relationship with ourselves and with others, and with our concept of a higher power, or what I like to call our relationship to the mystery. And we're going to define humility here in a minute. I grabbed this big fat dictionary. This is the American Psychological Association's Dictionary of Psychology. There's that many terms that we can define in psychology. Isn't that crazy? And they just happen to have a definition of humility, which I like much better than a definition of humility when I read it in just a regular dictionary. Here it says humility is the quality of being humble. Okay, well, what is that? Well, it's characterized by a low focus on the self. And let's think of self, as the imperial self, right? The king baby self or queen baby self, right? Don't think of self as a healthy self, but more as the ego that we hear talked about in the program. So it's characterized by a low focus on the self, an accurate, meaning not an over or underestimated sense of one's accomplishments and worth. We can overestimate ourselves, we can underestimate ourselves. Both of those are a failure of humility. And people don't understand that. They just think humility is like the opposite of that is arrogance. But you can have this negative arrogance too, where you're putting yourself down. And that's not humility either. That's a false humility. So it says an accurate sense of one's accomplishments and worth, and an acknowledgement of one's limitations, imperfections, mistakes, gaps in knowledge, and so on. So let me read that once again. Humility is characterized by a low focus on the self and an accurate, not over or underestimated sense of one's accomplishments and worth, and an acknowledgement of one's limitations, imperfections, mistakes, gaps in knowledge, and so on. So humility becomes a very important quality if we're going to achieve emotional sobriety. Because the way I like to think about it is that if I can stay in that humble place, then I have no business putting my expectations on how you're supposed to be. Right? That would be an overestimate. That's me playing God, right? Telling everybody else how they're supposed to behave and what they're supposed to do. And so the humility, and it also extends to life. It's also about expecting life to be a certain way. Who am I to expect that life is supposed to conform to my expectations? So you can see what made this such an important part of Bill's definition of emotional sobriety is that humility is so critical to our experience with this. He also goes on, and this is once again his explicit definitions of emotional sobriety, is unhooking people from our unreasonable claims, demands, or expectations. Right? That's an important part, is to be able to unhook people, right? Another way of thinking about it is unhooking is releasing them. Is once we become aware that we've put that expectation on others, this is where step 10 comes in. Promptly admit it, we were wrong. We'll get to that when we get to step 10 and what a crucial part of this emotional sobriety that is. The other things that's explicit in this is Bill is really advocating for what I would like to define as self-validated self-esteem. is to be able to validate himself instead of looking for his validation from others. So he's looking at self-validated self-esteem, not other validated self-esteem. Now, what's implicit in his definition of emotional sobriety is this idea of radical responsibility, that I am 100% responsible for what I'm experiencing, for the existence that I've created in my life. Now, that doesn't mean that I might have not have been victimized as a child, might not have been molested or been exposed to abuse or whatever, gone through some kind of a trauma. That doesn't exclude that. It just says it's my responsibility to deal with that and to digest that experience so that I grow from it, that I don't continue to be a victim from it. So he advocates this radical responsibility for our life, going on to say that no one makes us feel anything. I feel what I feel because of what I feel, not because of what you're doing to me. It's what I'm doing to me. That's radical responsibility. Our language is just so riddled with this thing about you make me feel, right? You make me angry. You make me feel this way. If you catch yourself saying that, you are abdicating responsibility for your life. And that shows where you need to grow yourself up. Nobody makes you feel anything. You're feeling what you feel because of what you're thinking and what you're feeling and what it means to you, not because of what anybody else is doing. Somebody says, well, how about if somebody stuck a gun to your head? Isn't that going to make you afraid? I'd say not unless what if I was suicidal? If they stuck a gun to my head, I'd say, please pull the trigger. I won't have to do it. I don't give a shit. I'm done with this life anyway. It goes to, if there's value in my life that I put on my life, then I'm going to be worried about the gun in my head. If not, I'm going to say, come on, man, please pull the trigger. Nobody makes you feel anything. Also implicit in his definition of emotional sobriety is this idea about not taking anything personal. What other people do, they don't do to you. That's who they are. That says nothing about who you are. But when we are immature emotionally, we are going to take what other people does to us very personally. And we're going to think it's a reflection of how they feel about us. And no, it's a reflection of who they are. If you take it personally, it's a reflection of your maturity, or your immaturity, I should say. Also implicit in his idea is what we would call a deliberate practice, that we need to remain conscious of these dynamics in our emotional dependency and the gravitational force of that on a daily basis. So we don't let the worst in us run the rest of us. We want the best in us to run the show, not the worst in us. And that's the Dr. Jekyll that he talks about. Bill says that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, the Dr. Jekyll is your healthy part. The Mr. Hyde is the dependent part, right? That wants everything to go his way, everybody to do what he wants to do. So I think that becomes a very, very important foundation for us to understand the steps. And let's just say a few things about the steps that I think will be important as we continue this discussion. So the steps are what we would call sequentially interdependent, which means that each step is building on the step before it, that there's a certain energy that is released when you do step one that now carries you in the direction of step two. And when you take step two, there's an energy that is now created that compels you to step three. And that building, right, that building of emotional sobriety continues through the whole steps. So it's important to understand that as we work them, that sequential interdependence is an important part of the experience that we're going to have as we work these steps to achieve emotional sobriety. So I think that's a very important thing to understand. You can also loosely categorize the steps in the following way. The first 7 steps are to look at our relationship with ourselves and our problems. So they are helping us develop a healthier relationship and a healthier perspective on who we are and a healthier relationship with the issues that we're struggling with in our life. The next three steps are related to our relationships with others, steps 8, 9, and 10. And then the last two steps are to continue our growth, because one of the things that becomes obvious is that if we stop and we don't continue this process on a daily basis, you don't just stay where we're at, you regress. You know, Dr. Harry Tebow, which was the first psychiatrist who befriended Alcoholics Anonymous, said that the ego has an uncanny way of regenerating itself, which means that your Mr. Hyde can come back into your life in a heartbeat. And so we have to have like a guardian, right, at the gates of our consciousness to pay attention to that, so that doesn't happen in our life. So that gives you somewhat of a definition of emotional sobriety. It gives you some idea of the steps. And let's start to look at step 1. And like I said, we'll just look at that for a brief period today, and we'll go into it much more next week. So step 1 is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. So the admission of being powerless. Wow, what a huge undertaking that is. Now, based on everything that I understand about our human development, is that early on in life, we became anxious that we were not going to be loved, we were not going to be accepted, and we were not going to belong. And that anxiety required us to come up with a solution. You cannot live in a state of anxiety. You know, those of you that have experienced extreme anxiety, you understand how debilitating it is. It is crippling. You know, I've had anxiety where I've been in the fetal position. You cannot function. And we're talking about now going back to our early years in life, 2, 3, 4 years old. So however we experience it at that point, which a lot of it's pre-verbal, that anxiety is requiring us to do something about it. And what do is we come up with some idea of who we're supposed to be in order to be okay. So we have to take control of ourselves so we can control what's going to happen around us. That's before alcoholism or any other addiction shows up on our doorstep. This is what we've done to try to have a solution, is we try to change ourselves so we can control our environment to do what we want it to do. So for us to admit we're powerless, are you kidding me? That's like, you know, it's like saying, let me welcome all that anxiety back in my life. My God. So that's why this step has become such an obstacle for so many people, because for us, being a control freak was a life preserver. We thought this is how we were going to get through life. This is what we were going to do to keep us from drowning. And now you're saying, Dr. Berger, give up the life preserver? You got to be crazy. And I would say, I am. I know that. That's why I'm less crazy today, because I know I'm crazy, right? It's that thing. So that's the dilemma that we're confronted with here. And this is what makes this first step so important, because it comes back to the experience of humility. And I will say this, and then I'll shut up and let Mary make a comment on this.
Now we will. We are.
This is what Bill said about humility. In an article, he called it Humility for Today. He go, this is why I see humility for today as that safe and secure stance midway between these violent emotional extremes. It is a quiet place where I can keep enough perspective and enough balance to take my next small step up the clearly marked road that points towards eternal values. That's where we're heading. So Mary, let me stop, and then we'll further this discussion next week, and let me turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. I really, really like that. I like that we're talking about emotional sobriety in relation to the steps. And as you were talking, the word that kept coming up for me is consciousness, being conscious. And of course, and at least I know when any of us enter a program of recovery, we're not really conscious. We're just thrown into the program because we've hit a bottom of some kind, we've lost things. And what came to mind when you were talking about the humility and the imperial ego. And it just struck me because I had my book open, Breathing Underwater by Richard Rohr. And he talks about letting go is not in anybody's program for happiness. And yet all mature spirituality in one sense or another is about letting go and unlearning. And when you talked about, it can't be dependent on somebody else, our expectations, when we have expectations, somebody else, some situation, some job, some person is going to make us happy, then we're giving away really our true self, our authentic self. So and we're going back to the false self. And I think when I heard you talking about that, that really kind of triggered the other part of what I've heard with when somebody comes into early recovery, or even it can happen when people are along, fairly many years of sobriety, where they have an opinionated mind, a closed down heart, and a well-defended body. And those three things are not open. And that really lends to what you said about then the imperial ego takes over. And that can take over at any point if we're not working on our own maturity and our own growth. And we take things personally. I love what you said, not taking things personally, even with the gun at the head. And then I jotted another thing down about this, and I think that'd be enough out of me. When you talked about we taking responsibility and emotional maturity, emotional sobriety, is when we're early in recovery, we don't have the ability to respond. That's why we need sponsors. We need other people in the program. We need lots of meetings, and we continue to need that. Our growth just changes as we move along on the path of recovery. But we don't have the ability to respond because we're still responding from the ego. Oh, I hope I look good. I hope I'm saying the right thing. I hope so-and-so likes me, and all of the things that make up that false imperial ego. And then this other thing struck me, and I jotted it down. It was about, when we're moving along on our recovery and we think we're probably pretty emotionally mature and in sobriety, we have some emotional sobriety, something will come your way that you cannot manage on your own. And that's that whole piece of, we're not in this alone. We're not on this recovery path alone. Yes, we need community, and yet we also need to be contained with our own self. And that's what I heard you saying when you were talking about the steps in our relationship to ourself, our true self, and then our relationship to other people. And that develops over time. So I appreciated hearing that and that powerlessness thing. And I don't think I have anything else except this last thing. And that was the thing about the imperial ego, which keeps doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results without reaching out for help, without saying, you know what, I don't think I'm handling this too well. I don't think I'm handling this maturely. Can you help me with that? And that's an act of emotional sobriety, when we can reach out and say to someone, you know what, I'm having trouble with this particular step, or I'm having trouble with this particular character defect, or I'm having trouble with managing my life in this particular area. So there's a lot of food for thought, and just that whole, just the one step and emotional sobriety. So thanks.
Thank you, Mary. That was a wonderful discussion. And that's what this community is here, right? Is really creating a community of like-minded people to share this understanding of emotional sobriety and begin to think about how we can plug this into our life.